Hey guys, welcome to Aligning Objectives with Inquiry Activities. Since we're a smaller number for right now, guys, just have a conversation with me, talk to me, let me know you're there, unmute yourself at any point and let's talk it out. So glad to see some new faces and some familiar faces. So and just to plug it already, after this, we'll have our 30-minute Create Cafe to give us the opportunity to continue to chat about some of these topics because this alignment is one of its series. So definitely want to offer opportunities to talk even deeper about some of this stuff. I'm hearing a little echo, so if you wouldn't mind muting, making sure you're mute, just so that we don't have any here we go. So we don't have any background noise for now, and then unmute yourself so that you can have a conversation with me. But for those of you who don't know who we are the TGR EDU Create team. And this small but mighty team is responsible for our professional learning program where we talk about inquiry-based instruction, student-centered approaches through all different content and career connections content areas, and really exploring how to incorporate these into our classrooms for powerful instruction. And today I'm going to be your lead facilitator. I'm Jessica Kessler, but you can just call me Jess. And I'm going to be your professional development facilitator. As Jason said, I'm on the East Coast. I'm actually in Virginia. And my education or experience in education has been teaching 4th through 12th grade, primarily in Philadelphia, and even still virtually. And I hold degrees in chemistry and educational leadership. Jason is also in the room with me. Jason, say hey to the peoples.
Hello, everyone. Really glad you could join. I'm also based on the East Coast, and I'm in Pennsylvania, and my background is also teaching primarily in Philadelphia, more in biology and life science kind of area. But yeah, really excited to learn with you all today and get into it.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason. And of course, our workshop norms that we always have. You guys should be used to these by now because we have been zoomed out since about March, but mics are on silent just to eliminate any background noise. But we would love to see your face and love to hear what you have to say. So use the chat to its fullest extent. Any thoughts, questions, comments, whatever the case may be, what you plan to have for lunch. I mean, anything. Throw it into the chat. We love to read it out and see what you guys are up to and think. But also just unmute yourself. Like I say, small in number, let's have a conversation. And I would love to see your face if we can. So please allow us to do that if you have the capacity to. These are some icons that you'll see throughout the day. We will have one breakout room activity where you guys will collaborate on a Google slide. So you'll see those when we get there. But like I said, the chat box and that mic, use it to its fullest extent so we can hear everyone's voice. So today is going to be pretty straightforward, just so we can have a lot of time to have conversations about some of these things. But we want to talk about the significance of misalignment. Like I said, this is a first of 2 parts, and we'll have the other part next month. But really trying to create the foundation of why is misalignment or this conversation around misalignment so important, and how does it impact our classroom, even in ways that we might not realize, and how can we reduce that by making sure that alignment is in place. So we're going to talk about constructing objectives and how to align our sequence of activities to the objectives that we are able to create. So this is where we start that conversation, where it's a little less of me and more of you guys. So I would love to hear out what happens when things are misaligned. So for you, those of you who have felt like you experienced misalignment in your classrooms, even in observing other classrooms or spaces, how does it feel? What does it look like? Can you give me an example of a time where you saw misalignment taking place, and what was happening in that classroom at that time? So feel free to unmute yourself, or I mean, that might be a lot to type in the chat, so I encourage unmuting yourself, but you can also type it into the chat as well. I see typing faces. Feel free to unmute yourself. I would love to hear your experiences.
Jess, I'll share something just to get it started. I think a classic example in the early days of STEM, when it was still like spheros and 3D printers, was like just put those in a classroom and that was STEM. You would see a lot of like, for example, with spheros, there'd be a math lesson. Like, oh, we're going to use spheros to draw shapes and learn about math. And a lot of times would just end up being fun with spheros, which was fun, engaging, and great. And kids really loved it. But at the end of the day, they didn't learn anything about the shapes that they were supposed to be learning about. So I think that's kind of a classic example.
Definitely. Thanks, Jason, for sharing that out. Anyone else?
So I can talk. I work in digital learning, and something that we frequently see talking sort of on that engagement piece is we see teachers choosing engagement, but not necessarily engagement with content. So we see them engaging with this really fun app that makes the kids really excited for 5 seconds. And then there's really not any learning happening. They're not engaging with any real content. So I see a lot of misalignment in that way.
Thanks, Katie, for sharing that out. So true, right? We so highly value students being engaged in what we're doing 100% that sometimes we sacrifice some content connections, and that's 100% true. Anyone else?
I can address that a little bit. I see the same things, and I know that in my schools, it leads to a lot of teacher frustration because oftentimes they do not see that things are not lining up.
100%. I love that you brought that up because one, I owe you some Skittles. If you were in person with me, I'll be throwing candy your way. But since you're not, I'm going to give you some shine and some snacks. But
I like Skittles.
I know, right? I need some Skittles right now too. That's 100% true. And that has been my experience where it's like, I'm like, okay, we've been learning this for 2 weeks, guys. Like, where is the problem? Every time you guys take the test, the average is like a 60. Where is the problem? And the problem wasn't the kids, it was me. And I didn't have the insight to be able to recognize that. So I'm so glad that you brought that up. So as we think about misalignment or these issues with alignment, the first thing that came to my mind was kind of this system. So I'm actually going to show you guys this video, and I want you guys to think about how the misalignment in this video of a shaft in this system can be compared to misalignment of content in your classroom, okay? So this is going to stay up on the screen so you guys can take a look. You just want to add some stuff to the chat while you're watching so you don't forget, feel free to. And I'm just going to share my sound so everything comes through. Perfect. All right, and play this video.
In this video, we'll take a look at 5 of the most common negative effects misalignment can have on your machinery. Number 1, seal failure. Mechanical seals are very expensive, and when one fails, fluid leaks can adversely affect other machine components. Number 2, bearing failures. In addition to the replacement cost of bearings, you may also suffer damage to other components, with an even greater loss to downtime. Number 3, energy loss. Misalignment makes a machine less efficient, resulting in wasted energy and higher power consumption. Number 4, increased vibration. Misalignment is the #1 cause of excessive vibration. As vibration levels increase, machinery reliability decreases. And number 5, excessive heat. Excessive heat indicates you have machinery problems. Not only does it contribute to the breakdown of lubrication, it can also pose a safety concern. Shaft alignment of rotating equipment is an essential part of machinery maintenance. Visit vibraline.com to learn more.
Okay, so with that video kind of in the back of your mind, how do you see some of those misalignments that we see in this shaft or in this machine compared to some of the things that you might see or feel in a classroom?
So the example with the word overheated, that was the one that kind of hit me, because sometimes when you think you're doing one thing and the students are picking up something else, they start to get frustrated, or the teacher gets frustrated. And so that kind of builds because it's not going where you intended it to go, or they can't get there.
So true. Thank you for sharing that out. You're like, what's going on? And like everybody's high intensity, and now kids are yelling, you're yelling, everybody's upset. Anything else stand out to you guys in the video?
I connected with how it wastes time. It ends up wasting time when things are not aligned, and like costs money in the sense of time, or being able to get everything working again. And that could be easily connected to the classroom.
Oh, for sure, because time is like our worst enemy, right? We don't have any, and we have to make use of every second that we have. So that misalignment just causes us loss in a lot of different ways, or resources, right? Because if you spent your own money, which we always do, on buying manipulatives or lab items, and then there's this misalignment and you just wasted, that experience, and the kids didn't get what they needed to get. Anybody else?
Well, the simplest alignment I run into is that the kids don't come in with the background that I thought they should have. Like they don't know what, just your basic coordinates, up and to the right in a Cartesian coordinate. What coordinate is this? They don't know that's the first. It's like, where have you guys been?
Right, that's a good one. That's one that's not even in the video. That could be something like buying the wrong part, right? If you have the wrong tools coming in, you can't fix the problems, right? So that's one that's not even in the video. Thanks for sharing that out, Greg. Love that. All right, well, let's take a look. So these are some that I thought of as I was watching this video. Okay, there we go. As I was watching this video, of some of the ones that they said. So they mentioned about steel breaks and fluid leaks. And for me, part of this was like information overload, right? When we misalign activities or objectives with activities, we tend to try to overcompensate by giving like a lot of lecture or a lot of the missing pieces so that they get it without us having to necessarily reteach it. And for students, that's confusing. That's information overload. They're like, what am I supposed to do with all the stuff that she's throwing at me? They don't recognize that there's actually a misalignment happening and how to use the rest of that information. The bearing failure, where you saw all of the bearings kind of flying out, everything. Major confusion, students understanding all over the place, right? You get like 50 different thousand answers for one question that you thought you hit, but now students are just all over the place, right? Energy loss, this is a big one, right? Teacher burnout, right? When there's misalignment and students don't meet that objective, at the end of the day, that's something you have to teach again. So you've been covering the same information now for some time, and you're just like wearing yourself down. But if alignment was there, then you would have been able to make those connections the first time around rather than having to continue to do those reteachers, which is a big deal. Increased vibration. This is the wheels turning, but no learning happening, right? Sometimes students really want to get it. They're like really trying to figure this thing out, but because of the misalignment, they can't get to the end result that you want them to get to. And that is a big part of that vibration. Like they're really trying to get it, but no learning is happening because of that misalignment. And that excessive heat, which Katie brought up earlier, that student burnout. Like students get tired of trying to get that same thing over and over again and feeling the failure, right? Because on one end, they might think it's them, they're feeling that failure and they get burnt out. So not only is your teacher burned out now because you have to do a reteach like 50 times, but now the students are burned out because they don't understand why we keep having to go over the same information and what's happening. Any thoughts or comments about some of these connections that I made between that shaft misalignment and the classroom misalignment?
I just like the comparison of a physical motor running versus like what we feel happening in the classroom. I just like that.
Awesome.
That physical thought of it.
Right. I saw this video and I was like, oh my gosh, this is a classroom, right? Because technically your classroom is that machine. It is a machine. It has a bunch of moving pieces. Your students are one part of the puzzle. You're another part of the puzzle, the system. The information that's flowing between you guys is another part of that system. And so when there's misalignment somewhere, there's definitely going to be some kind of system failure somewhere that we need to figure out, right? So this video was just, I was like, oh my gosh, I got to put this into a workshop and get this going. So thanks so much for bringing that in. Trent said, I like the system views of this process and how maintenance and reflection is important, for sure. So now that we know what that misalignment can look like or feel like, and have that kind of perspective of the system, now it's about the system maintenance. How do we go in and start correcting some of these pieces, right? It's about doing that diagnostic and then being able to go in with the proper tools and fix that. And one of the ways in which we see that happening is by aligning your courses and or the instruction that comes from it. So with that being said, this is basically the structure of any given classroom at any given time. Of course, we got a lot of zigzags that might flow through this chart, but an objective happens, we have an objective, we plan some activities, and then we assess it, right? Sometimes we go off this a little bit and we have some tangents and stuff like that, but essentially we have an objective, we have our activities, and we need an assessment. So today, as we talk about this alignment, let me minimize this, is that course alignment is simply the alignment and connections between the learning objectives through your activities and through that assessment, right? An aligned course means that your learning objective, activities, and assessments match up so students can learn what's intended and you can accurately assess it. Sometimes we get so misaligned that even though we have an objective there and we did 15,000 activities in order to illustrate it, students still fail assessments, not for lack of trying or lack of understanding, but just because they did not match up with what they actually did in the class. So they're basing their assessment answers on what they did, but our objective might have been something completely off, and now our assessment doesn't align. We see this all the time, very often, very common. So we all know pretty much what objectives are, activities are, and assessments are, but for those of you who might just want to refresher so we have common language, they're up here on the screen. I'm not going to read them out to you. But essentially today we're focusing on those objectives and activity alignment. And then next month, when you guys come back and see me again, we're going to talk about how to bring in the assessments as well. So focusing on one part of the system, and then we'll focus on the next. So let's talk about objectives. Objectives can be written 10 million different ways. I promise you, I've been to, I don't know how many schools, and every school I go into, they're like, write your objectives this way. And I'm like, okay, I learned 15,000 ways to write objectives. But essentially, they should have these three components, right? They have a target audience, who's doing the work. They tell us, you know, what's the action? What are we going to be doing? And then what do we want kids to learn at the end, which is basically the part that we're going to assess them on. And so these three components are always essential to an objective, no matter how you write it or what format. So as an example, I have here, students will research solutions to water pollution in the Gulf of Mexico. So we have our target audience, you know, that's our students. We have our action verb, which is to research. And we also have our learning outcome, which is water pollution solutions in the Gulf of Mexico, okay? So I have a couple examples here just so we can see all of them, but these are some of the most important components here. Feel free to take a screenshot or something if you're a program director or you're going over this with other educators. We would be surprised how many educators either don't know how to construct objectives with these three things inside of them, and or are given a lot of their objectives and just haven't had the experience of writing them themselves. And so sometimes having this common language and like illustrating this to them is really impactful because they haven't had to do it. So with all the curriculum that we're given, sometimes we just don't know how to write an objective or how to break an objective down, which also leads to misalignment. Because if I've never written an objective and I don't know how to break it down, I'm just going to assess what I think this objective is trying to say instead of really trying to break down the pieces and get to where I need to get to. So with that being said, one of the most key things here in order to create strong alignment, really strong alignment, is that action verb. Because whatever that action verb is the intention of that student or what you intend for that student to be able to do by the end of that. And that is what you need to be assessing. So these are some guidelines for some action verbs, right? They should be clear, specific, and measurable. And I know that sounds like, of course they should be. but we get this all the time, right? Because how many objectives have you seen where it's like, I want students to understand X, Y, Z? How do you measure their understanding, right? Like, how is that specific? Is that clear? How do you give them a paper and say, understand this, right? And they'll just say, okay, that's not very clear. So it's about going past that and really getting specific. So some examples of this are listed here. For those of you who have heard of Bloom's, we could go into all the Bloom spectrums and stuff like that. But honestly, whether it's Bloom's or someone else, it's just about the action verb itself. Okay. So oftentimes I've worked with teachers and they're like, I want students to understand, or I want students to learn or improve or increase. And I'm like, well, how do you measure that? If you can't measure it or really think about how that's going to show up on an assessment, then that's probably not the correct terminology that you want to use. Of course, we want every student to learn. We want every student to understand, but those are overarching things. We need to be really concrete and specific when we're talking about planning instruction. So Trent asked, should action verbs be cognitive action versus physical action? Great question. And honestly, it could be a combination of them, right? Because one, you can have more than one objective per activity. So one of those could feature an action verb, a cognitive one, and one can feature a physical one. But it also depends on what you're teaching and what you're trying to assess. So if I'm doing a hands-on activity and I want students to build, then I want them to build. Like, that's a physical action. If I want my students to draw something, that's a physical action. I want them to actually draw it out. But if I want them to be able to compare, then that might be something more cognitive when I'm asking them to think about this essay and compare it to this poem. What are the common themes that are here, right? That's more cognitive. So it just depends on what it is that you want the students to be able to do. Any other questions coming out as you're kind of taking a look at these examples versus non-examples? Any other thoughts or experiences kind of related to this that you guys want to share out?
I feel like I see know and understand very commonly as objectives. And those are under the non-examples.
Exactly. Anybody else?
Jess, I was just going to add one thing because what Trin said is really stuck in my head. I think that was a really great comment. And it probably really great to put both in there, right? So if you want a student to learn how to measure something, that might be one objective. But then the next stage, you might want them to be able to describe why that measurement's important and what error is associated. The next day, discuss different measures that are important to use. So I think, mixing it up is probably great.
For sure. And even going back to what Katie said, we see a lot of understand and know. Sometimes we put those there as placeholders because we haven't thought through it yet, right? So think about how you feel. Our lesson plan should be on Thursday. Thursday night, I'm exhausted, I'm drained. I got to come up with 5 lesson plans for next week. I haven't even gotten there yet. We put placeholders. We're like, I really don't even know what I need to teach next week, but I want to put this placeholder here. So I'm just going to say they're going to understand how to balance chemical equations because I don't know exactly what they're going to do yet. And that's something that we kind of fall into a habit of, is by putting these non-examples in places where we just don't know yet. And we never go back to change those to be more specific. So we leave those in there in places where we can definitely be more specific and actionable. Okay, so with that being said, once we solidify those action verbs, then we can get really specific about how we align our activities to these objectives, right? So if you want students to research and you're that specific, you can get students into that research. Okay, everybody get on that computer, or everybody find those resources, and you're going to take the time to research. It's very, very clear what you want them to do. Students will write a report. Very clear what the student is going to be doing as their activity. I'm going to be writing a report today. So not only does this clarify how you're going to assess students later, but this makes it super plain what students will be doing in the moment. I'm going to research today. I'm going to write a report today. I'm going to build a model today. so that when administrators even walk into the room, you know, you always have that one administrator that comes in, makes a lot of noise, right? Because no administrator walks in quietly. They make a lot of noise. They sit next to a kid and they say, hey, what are you learning today? What are you going to be doing today? And the kids are like, I will understand this. And they're like, well, how? You know, they start to probe the kids, and the kids don't clearly understand what they're doing. But when you have action verbs that are this clear, even your students can follow along with this and give that information back to you. So when you say, today we're writing a report about, you know, these effects and of this, that, and the third, kids will be able to say, today we're writing a report, because it's that clear to them and they understand exactly what it is that they're going to be doing today. Love it. So let's talk about aligning those activities. So now that you have this action verb that's super clear, you're like, hey, my learning outcome is simply what I need kids to know. I want them to research these solutions to water pollution. So everybody get out your books, get out the videos that I sent you last week, get on the internet, let's research some solutions, and then you can start adding in all of the requirements or other things that you want them to be able to do. So give me 3 resources that include technology, one that doesn't include technology, or whatever the case may be. Then you can start being more specific in your details in their assignments. You write a report, 3 effective solutions to water pollution in the Gulf of Mexico. Now I want you to use that research and now write that report based off of what you found. So now you're building on your objectives, and the learning outcomes become more clear and specific and start to build out. Now I want you to build a model that shows me those 3 techniques. So now I'm layering on that information by building on these objectives in different ways. And even if I wanted to break these objectives down even further, the first one can say, I want you to find 3 sources of information that relate to water pollution. Then you can say, I want them to research. You can even break them down even further and still keep action verbs and the learning outcome in mind. Okay, so now that we have those action verbs solid and our objectives are really clear, really concise, because they have an action verb and that learning outcome, now the activity really falls straight from those pieces of information. So that objective was really core to be able to create that alignment, because the clearer your objective is, the better and stronger that alignment is going to be to the objectives, which you can see from these examples that I've just reiterated 1,000 times, right? So any thoughts, comments, questions up to this point about how you form that objective, how you can break down that objective, and how that activity strongly should correlate to that objective? Let me see a thumbs up or a head nod or something that says, yeah, I got it, Jess. This makes perfect sense to me. Okay, cool, great. Okay, good. Now I see it. Everybody gave me the blank stare. I'm like, what is happening? Okay, good. So it's making sense. Everybody's on the same page. Everybody can see it. So let's actually go into groups for a little while. And we're going to have about 20 minutes to do this. And I want you guys to actually practice some of this stuff, but also have a discussion with the other people in your group about how this kind of comes together for you. So what you're going to be doing is, in groups, you're going to use some of those strong verbs. You're going to be using some of the information that we just talked about objective alignments and activities, and you guys are going to be kind of filling in those gaps. So let me actually show you what this looks like. You all are going to receive a link to a Google slide, which you'll share with your group. Jason's going to add that into the chat when he gets a chance. And if you are in group, let's say breakout room number 1, you'll work on slide number 1, which is for group 1. If you're in breakout room number 2, you'll work on slide 2, and so forth. In this slide, you're going to fill in the missing activity or objective based on the one provided. So if you have an objective, you're going to say, what's the activity you would have students do? If you have a activity, then you're going to fill in what objective will we write from this. And I understand that going backwards from activity to objective could be a little bit more challenging, but think about how many times we said, oh, I wish I could do this in my classroom. And then we try to find a way to make it happen. That's a part of having an activity in mind first and then trying to come up with an aligning objective. So still definitely in the ballpark of things that we could do. Once you kind of finish this brief practice, go into some discussion. How have you experienced misalignment? Was this activity challenging for you, and in what ways? Do you regularly make use of a wide variety of action verbs, or do you tend to use the same verbs over and over again? And how might that be impacting your instructions? And do you have any questions that arise after you kind of work on this together? So Jason should have, I can't see my Jason right. Exactly. Jason has excellently added in there a verbs PDF, so some action verbs that you guys could take a look at, and also the link to the working group, which I see several of you are already in. So when Jason's ready, he's going to put us into those groups, and you guys will have about 20 minutes to dive into this activity, and we'll come back and reflect and share out together. Okay, welcome back, guys. I heard some great conversations. I see a lot of great stuff happening on your slides. I saw a lot of people putting in multiple activities like you see here with group one. I saw a lot of great things and heard some great questions. So I'm just going to open the floor up for any comments. You know, how was this activity? What were you thinking about? Were there any areas you got stuck, or were there just any general reflections about alignment and how it happens, or how it can easily derail and become misalignment? So opening the floor. It's a great time, how we think about it. You guys are all going to go home, or you already probably are home, but practice your shadowing techniques for eyes, for drawing really expressive eyes, right? I come up with these random examples for our workshop. So anything come up for you guys while you're working through this? Anything interesting come up in your conversations where you were like, you're right, or that's a good point?
I think one of the things that came up for us in group one had to do with question 3 on the discussion on the side, making use of a wider variety. You know, we kind of get stuck in that rut of using the same action verb, and trying to figure out ways to break out of that rut.
For sure. I love that. And that was definitely one of the reasons why I put that there, because once you use analyze like 40 times, right? Now, every lesson you want them to define something. Like, how many times can they define this one thing? So switching up the action verb, like I said, blooms, most of us have heard of blooms, especially when we go through our teacher trainings, but he kind of breaks down, obviously, the spectrum of like when to use what verbs, right? What cognitive level do you want students to be at when you use that verb? Do you want them to be exhibiting just memory, because that's all that definition is, or matching is just about recall? Or do you want them to go deeper and start to compare and contrast and analyze and really use some higher levels of cognitive work for the student? So not to go too far into blooms, because obviously changes have been made to blooms, and there are some other people that you can follow as far as action verbs are concerned. But thinking about, you know, what do I want students to do, and at what level do I want them to be reaching as far as their cognitive effort, has a lot to do with how you can change that one verb to something else and come up with a completely different impact for the student. So instead of defining something, now maybe they are analyzing it or illustrating it, right? So it's taking that one verb, changing it to something else, and stepping up the cognitive work that's being done at the same time. So keep this with you. I used to have this like pasted on my wall. At one point, one school that I was with, we had to use blooms every time, and we had to like outline what bloom word we were using. So I just kept this kind of like right next to me at all times to kind of work that out. Anything else pop up in your discussions?
Not in our discussion, but I do definitely want to talk about the metacognition, always a reflection piece after every project, because a lot of them didn't quite get it, especially if they didn't contribute. You know, the ones that are hands off, and so that you can say, okay, what did you do? What did you do? What could you do better? And how come your results were a little bit different than Team B's results? And where would you have done something differently, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think oftentimes we neglect anecdotal notes, one, because they're a lot of work, but anecdotal notes also point out misalignments that we can't see, because the student can feel something that we can't necessarily always see in that moment. And they're just like in a place where they might be stuck. And like Greg said, that might be that quiet student who just feels like this isn't right, but I don't speak up enough to be able to say something to the teacher. And you start to see where, oh, you misinterpreted what I said, or something here is off, and you start seeing the smaller components of misalignments happening, and you can catch those before they turn into a bigger thing, right? Before it turns into those ball busters coming out and spraying everywhere. You can catch smaller things by just being that person that's asking around of what's going on and getting those anecdotal kind of notes going.
Yeah, and just to add something to that, Greg, I think it's really interesting for those that are still involved in remote teaching. The chat is a really interesting place for that reflection, especially for those who don't want to speak up. I think a lot more kids feel like they can talk in the chat a little bit, so that can be a really great place for that.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
For sure.
All right, so with that being said, we are coming down to the end of our time together. So some just kind of reflective or best practices, kind of like Greg said, you always want to reflect at the end of a big project, right? So these are just kind of some reflective notes that I had in preparing this. Is one, using clear, concise language. The more specific you are and clear your language is, not only will the student understand what's going on and be able to regurgitate that back to you or administrators, but it makes the activity so much easier to align, right? So in one group, I think Katie said, the objective said build an activity. Is it too straightforward to just put that as the activity? And I was like, no, right? Because as soon as your objective is that clear, and the activity becomes a no-brainer, and you automatically have that alignment right. Use measurable goals, verbs, right? What can you measure? You can't measure, I want them to learn, right? You got to be able to measure something that's going to be tangible for them. You want them to build it. You want them to compare and contrast. Use more than one objective if needed. So if you have something that's really heavy, right? Like by the end of the day, you want them to be able to balance chemical equations, but before they do that, they might have to do 2 other smaller steps. So build those 2 smaller steps into separate objectives so that you can clearly measure each one. So by the end of that day, you say, these were my 2 to 3 objectives. I can clearly measure each one. If you make the objective too bulky, it becomes more difficult to measure and it becomes less clear and concise. Build objectives to meet larger goals. So let them build on one another as you continue to go. And for some reason, I can't see the last one. What's the last one say, Jason, or someone else?
Keep the end in mind.
Keep the end in mind. For some reason, my bar won't go down on Zoom so I can see it, but thank you, Greg. Keep the end in mind. So as you're building onto your objectives and building these action verbs, you always want to have, what is the overarching outcome that students need to have, whether it's by the end of the month, end of the semester, right before that test that's coming up. What are all those things so that you can constantly build on them in a strategic way that helps you get to that end goal? All right, so with that being said, are there any other reflective pieces on any of these or anything else that we talked about today? I was that clear, guys. I'm going to take that as a sign. I was super clear and concise. I was specific. I used measurable. So thanks. So as we're closing out, like I said, this was part 1 of 2 parts. So in February, when you guys come back to see me on the 10th, we're going to talk about how to align those assessments with those objectives and activities. So now we're going to take the back end and really think about how to construct those so that we're actually measuring what we intended. because oftentimes we create assessments or we use assessment creators. I felt so lucky to find an assessment generator and realize that it was so far off from what I was actually trying to teach that no matter what it generated, my kids were going to fail it because they had no idea what was going on. So how to accurately do that. And then as you continue to come back, we have a list of workshops. So if you are a part of our educator community, which is right here on the screen, you can always join that, and we'll make sure that you are the first to hear about any of our upcoming workshops. Please stay for Create Cafe. We're going to stay on for about a half an hour and talk a little bit more about this topic. Jason found some great stuff, some cool things about NGSS that he's going to kind of lead us in conversation around. Look for us on YouTube to hear all of our other insightful workshops, and use TGR EDU Explore for all of our free educator and student resources. Jason has put a link in the chat that has our survey. We would love your feedback. You can be as honest as you want to be. Again, we're all educators, so we've heard the best and the worst of our feedback. So please feel free to be as honest as possible so that we can continue to get better and bring you reflective, responsive workshops in the future. So with that being said, thank you everyone for coming. So glad that you all came. I'm so happy to hear all the conversation and reflections from today.